So this is a short bonus lecture about Richard Linche's Sonnet number 4. It focuses on the preparatory reading of the sonnet rather than the actual writing of the passage analysis, so it's also not that concerned with historical context or secondary sources. There it is in its 1596 original publication and a version with modernized spelling. So, what sugared terms, what all-persuading art, what sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks loved used for his admittance to my heart. Such eloquence was never read in books. He promised pleasure, rest, and endless joy, fruition of the fairest she alive. His pleasure pain, rest trouble, joy annoy, have I since found which me of bliss deprive. The Trojan horse thus have I now let in, wherein enclosed these armed men were placed. Bright eyes, fair cheeks, sweet lips, and milk-white skin, these foes my life have overthrown and razed. Fair outward shows prove inwardly the worst. Love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. And again. What sugared terms, what all-persuading art, what sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks, loved used for his admittance to my heart. Such eloquence was never read in books. He promised pleasure, rest, and endless joy, fruition of the fairest she alive. His pleasure pain, rest, trouble, joy annoy, have I since found, which me of bliss deprive. The Trojan horse thus have I now let in, wherein enclosed these armed men were placed. Bright eyes, fair cheeks, sweet lips, and milk-white skin, these foes my life have overthrown and razed. Fair outward shows prove inwardly the worst. Love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. Okay. So if you like, pause the video there and make some notes about what you think is going on in this poem, what interests you, and any questions. What is this sonnet about? It looks like it's probably about love, especially the feeling of being in love, about the difference between how things seem and how they are, about persuasion and perhaps deception too, and it's a sonnet which has some imagery of war in it, although the imagery is metaphorical. This poem isn't literally about any war. And those are some reasonable guesses to make about the poem after just reading it once or twice, even before we've really developed a very full understanding of it. Key words and phrases tell us about its likely themes. So now that we have a sense of what the poem might be about, let's sit down and figure what it's really about. Early on, you should look up any words you're unsure of, and even maybe look up words whose meaning you think you do know, but which look like they might be doing something strange or something crucial in this particular poem. Now, these are some of the terms that stuck out for me. And I won't go through them all, but here are some. Mellifluous means pleasant sounding, musical, beautifully flowing. Eloquence suggests beautiful, powerful, articulate speech. Fruition might suggest ripeness, although it has another meaning too, which I'll come to in a bit. Razed means completely demolished. And the major military image is of course the Trojan horse, which if you're not familiar with, I'd suggest you look up now, or just pause this and read through that slide. And there is potentially some more hidden military imagery. The speaker expects joy and instead gets annoy. In the 16th century, this word tends to be a bit stronger than merely, oh, how annoying, how irritating. It often means serious trouble or harm, and it can have a specifically military sense, as you'll see if you look it up on OED. To molest, injure, hurt, harm, now especially in military use. And you can look at the quotations to see that actually the military connotation goes back to at least the time of this poem. For looking up words, the Oxford English Dictionary, OED.com, can feel a bit overwhelming, but it really is the best. It gives lots of different definitions and uses quotations to demonstrate how a word's meaning has shifted over time. So the first definition of raise is shave, but when we scroll down to this sense, we get tear down, demolish, level, which makes lots more sense. That's what the speaker of this sonnet feels is happening to their life. With something like an early modern sonnet, word order can also pose a challenge. Okay, we know what a word means individually, but with this convoluted poetic syntax, it can be tricky to figure out how these words relate to each other. So you might want to try provisionally rephrasing the poem in your own words, just to get started. One possible interpretation of this poem, which a lot of you went for in your passage analyses, is that it is an expression of sorrow by someone who's been dumped by their lover. And I think that's a reasonably valid way of looking at the poem. You might have even detected a thematic resemblance with the Wyatt poem that we looked at, which I think definitely is about a relationship of some kind, probably sexual, which has now ended. But I also think there's some quite strong counter-evidence. There are reasons why we might not favour this reading. I'm not really sure this is a poem about somebody who was seduced, has now been betrayed or cast aside, and is reflecting bitterly on their lover's deceptive promises. I think it's actually a bit weirder than that. First of all, there are 3 figures here, not just 2. If you count the armed men in the metaphor, there are more than 3, but there are 3 main ones. There is an I in this poem, the speaker. There is a he in this poem, who is somebody different. And then there's a she in the poem, who may or may not be someone different, but probably is. So, first of all, who is the he? In the first 3 lines, the poem personifies or anthropomorphizes love. That is, it treats the abstract concept of love as a person. Specifically, the poem is probably talking about the god of love, Cupid, or Eros, who is often depicted as a male youth or a child with wings and a bow. If Cupid's arrow pierces your heart, you fall in love. But even if you didn't know that, you could still work out from the poem itself that love is being personified. So let's continue. What sugared terms, what all-persuading art, what sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks, love used for his admittance to my heart. It starts with what, so it sounds a bit like a question, but it's not actually a question. It's actually a demonstrative construction, a bit like, what a lovely day. It's just a way of drawing the reader's attention to the things that are listed. You guys are not going to believe the sugared terms love just used to slide into my heart, is what it's saying. So we have sugar, sweetness, eloquence, art. Now, many of you read this as a kind of catalogue of love's delights, a wholly positive portrayal of love. But look more closely. Love is also using wounding looks, that is, gazes that inflict pain. And isn't love's persuasiveness itself rather suspect? The speaker may have enjoyed being enticed and persuaded by love, but we can already tell that the speaker's autonomy, the speaker's will, has kind of been overridden by love. In other words, the speaker was trying to keep love out of his heart, but love got in anyway. So love has the art or skill of persuading anybody to do whatever love wants. If we look up mellifluous at oed.com, we find that it specifically means honey-like, from the Latin mel meaning honey and flura meaning to flow. So there's a lot of sweetness here, perhaps a sense of something cloying and sickly sweet, or something too good to be true. Love gets what he wants by using this kind of overly sweet, sugary rhetoric, which may well be insincere. So already the portrayal of love is quite mixed and interesting. It's not wholly positive. That line, such eloquence was never read in books, suggests that love speaks more beautifully and persuasively than the most beautiful and persuasive book. I also wonder if it might faintly suggest, more specifically, early modern rhetoric manuals such as George Putnam's Art of English Poesy and Henry Peacham's The Garden of Eloquence. Now, these were books which listed all kinds of rhetorical devices for writers to learn and use. So maybe the implication is that even if you know every trick in the book, love still has tricks that will fool you. So love has been portrayed in a sinister fashion, associated with sugariness and stickiness and insincerity. We hear a bit more about these promises that love makes. Love promises the speaker pleasure, rest, and endless joy. Okay. But the next line is more mysterious. I think a lot depends on that line. Love also promises fruition of the fairest she alive. Now just think about that line. It may at first seem a bit of a grammatical jumble, It's a thing, and love is promising this thing, and this thing is the fruition of someone, whatever fruition is. And this someone is the fairest she alive. So a rough paraphrase of the line is fruition of the most beautiful woman alive. Now, what gender is love? That's easy, personified as male. What gender is the speaker? I think we can't know for sure. I think, actually, there isn't going to be decisive evidence in this poem. I am going to use he in this lecture, but I think you would be within your rights to use the gender-neutral they. Here's another question. Assuming this poem is about falling in love with a specific person, what gender is that person? I don't think we know yet. Bright eyes, fair cheeks, sweet lips, and milk-white skin. These features are the enemies that have brought such disorder and destruction to the speaker's life. Do they suggest a woman? Well, I'm not sure that they do, really, but perhaps they do indirectly. The poetic device of describing somebody one feature at a time and comparing each feature to something is called a blazon. You know, your lips are like rubies, your hair is like a raven's wing. And a famous, albeit unusual example is Shakespeare's sonnet 130, which actually subverts the blazon technique by rejecting these comparisons. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Her lips are red, but not in the same way that coral is red. And the Linche line is quite a compressed blazon, and they're mostly being compared to the same kind of thing, a soldier, but I'd still say that it counts. So blazons were often used of women rather than of men, and perhaps not coincidentally if we recognise that this is a very disempowering, dehumanising, objectifying way of describing somebody, even if it is also complimentary. So that might give us a hint that maybe the beloved is a woman. It's not very strong evidence, though, and another piece of evidence we could use, by the way, is to read the whole sonnet sequence, since sonnets often do link up to tell a story or a set of stories. But let's not let ourselves do that now. The firmer evidence comes from this line, fruition of the fairest she alive. Now, fruition could mean something like full realization of one's potential. It could also mean something like ripeness or bearing of fruit. So perhaps there's a euphemistic sexual reference here, being ripe for the plucking, being ready, perhaps falling pregnant. This fruition is what love is promising to the speaker. But is the she the speaker or somebody else? Could it be the speaker? Fruition of the fairest she alive. Love is full of flattery. So if the speaker is a woman, love might well call the speaker the fairest woman alive. Well, I've already said that I think the speaker is a man, and that the person he's in love with is a woman. And you know how I know? The OED.com. Fruition doesn't just mean ripeness. It can also mean enjoyment or possession. Now I think the meaning of the line changes entirely. He promised pleasure, rest, and endless joy, and possession of the fairest woman alive. These are love's promises. There are still sexual overtones, of course, but with this sense of possession and ownership now at play, it has become frighteningly objectifying and hierarchical. So I think we figured out the genders as much as we can. Love is male, the beloved figure is female, and the speaker may remain a bit ambiguous, but I'm going to assume that the speaker is a man. So we can now notice something very weird about this poem. As it goes on, we really hear almost nothing about this woman that the speaker is supposedly in love with. In fact, the poem is filled with masculine pronouns, and the speaker even personifies the beloved's attractive features as a group of armed men. Your bright eyes are like some guy with a sword hiding in the darkness with a hammering heart. Your fair cheeks are like some other guy crammed in next to him. Your sweet lips, guy number 3. And here's Brad Pitt portraying the Greek soldier Achilles in the not very good movie Troy. So there's something mysterious going on here, which is good because mysteries make for interesting close readings. And we've actually come to the final couplet, which in this sonnet, as in many but not all Shakespearean style sonnets, purports to kind of sum up, to draw a general lesson and present that lesson in a compact, epigrammatic way. Fair outward shows prove inwardly the worst. Love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. So fair outward shows, that which looks beautiful on the outside, prove inwardly the worst. Those are the things that are actually the worst on the inside. And perhaps the speaker is still alluding to the Trojan horse, but the main sense here is love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. So is the speaker talking about his beloved? Is he saying, you seemed amazing, but now I know that was all a front? Well, it's not completely clear, but I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's suggesting that falling in love looks great from outside, but the experience of actually being in love is actually really painful. Or, okay, perhaps it's a bit of both. Perhaps he's alluding to both love's reputation as something beautiful and attractive, and how beautiful the specific person he's fallen in love with is. Now, if this were a different module, we might explore whether it was true that love looketh fair. We might do some research and find out whether love really did have such a great reputation at the time. But for this assignment, we're not looking at secondary sources. So the question instead is, why is love painful? Why is love painful in this poem in particular? And one really interesting suggestion that one of you made, love is painful because a loving relationship takes hard work. When you see those sickeningly happy couples, you may not realize how much work they put into their relationships. Another suggestion, love is painful because it is tempestuous, it's stormy. Arguments, fallings out, drama, maybe betrayals, breakups, heartbreaks. I think most of you who wrote about this poem went with that option. But there is another option. Love can be painful when you love somebody and they never love you back. What kind of love are we talking about here? Probably an infatuation, something nowadays we might not really call love, except a bit jokingly. We might call it love sickness, or put in more informal language, it's really fancying somebody, having a really massive crush on somebody. And what is this experience like? This kind of experience is a very irrational thing. You might feel this way about somebody who, on a rational level, you don't really admire or approve of or even really like that much. Not somebody you necessarily think of as relationship material. Let me be a little bit anachronistic and borrow these descriptions by a modern author. When you're in love in this way, everything you encounter returns your thoughts to the beloved. The moment you wake up, they're the first thing that springs into your consciousness. And you don't want to get up, you want to lie there daydreaming about them. All day long, you will daydream about them, whether you choose to or not. You hope and anticipate. You turn over their words and acts in your mind, seeking some hint that they could feel the same way. But you probably don't tell them about this. It's too risky. Maybe you try to keep it completely secret, or you try to flirt, send out ambiguous signals. Reason to hope combined with reason to doubt keeps passion at fever pitch. And I think that's the kind of emotional terrain of this sonnet. Now that we've established that, this question about the strange elusiveness of the beloved may become a bit clearer. The speaker talks about love more than the beloved herself. Love becomes a kind of pander or go-between with whom the speaker has constant contact, whereas the person he supposedly loves is distant and indistinct. If there is a woman in this text, she is very faint, very blurred and hard to make out. Now, I want to suggest 3 different ways in which we could interpret this. First, okay, what if there isn't a woman? What if the beloved is another man after all? The speaker's sorrows stem from the heteronormative, homophobic society that he lives in. Oppressive society might also be the reason to write about this experience in such a coded, indirect fashion. Okay, but wait, we should consider counter-evidence. What about this line, fruition of the fairest she alive? Didn't we say that tells us that the beloved is definitely female? Well, technically, fruition of the fairest she alive was only something that love promised to the speaker. And notice how love tends to promise one thing, but give the opposite. So you could build a reading of this poem in which the speaker thought that falling in love looked great. He couldn't wait to fall in love until he actually did, and had what he feels is the misfortune to fall in love with somebody inappropriate by the dominant norms of the time, somebody of his own gender. The word fair or fairest appears 4 times, always meaning beautiful seeming. But if we check the OED, we see that another sense of fair, just, legitimate, has also developed by the time the sonnet was written. So is there perhaps a preoccupation with what is fair and unfair? Even maybe a sort of barely expressed challenge? What kind of God rules against love between men and then plants that desire in the hearts of men? Surely not a fair God. And the word accursed is also interesting. It suggests being under a curse, the unwanted, intrusive obsession, and perhaps being doomed to misery. But accursed also has strong religious connotations. Accursed suggests being blasphemous, idolatrous, taboo, or banned, or of being shunned or cast out of society, or of being damned or distant from God. And you can get that from the OED, but you can also see it, for instance, in the Bible. Search for accursed and cursed in the Geneva translation of the Bible, and you can kind of get a sense of the word's nuance from the contexts in which it appears. So, have we done it? Have we figured out the big secret? Well, I have to say, I'm not sure about that interpretation, and we should also be careful of assuming that poems have big secrets. Often they don't. A second similar interpretation, which I'm even less keen on, is that the speaker really does believe himself to be in love with this fairest she alive, but he doesn't know his own heart very well. There's a lot of homoerotic subtext here, so perhaps his sorrows stem from trying to be in love with somebody to whom he's not really attractive. There's somebody else, a man, who keeps stealing into his thoughts and he hasn't figured out why yet. Now, there might be a good reading there, but I'd tread quite carefully. There is a real moral peril in proposing to act as a mirror for somebody. Even if that somebody is the persona of a 16th century sonneteer, it is a mirror that will show them what they supposedly really truly desire when they don't know it themselves. It's certainly a can of psychoanalytic worms that you might not want to open in a 500-word passage analysis, and it's not my favourite analysis. So let's move on to my favourite interpretation. While there is a homoerotic subtext, the speaker is infatuated with a woman. The reason she barely appears is that the speaker is kind of more interested in his own feelings than in the actual living being that those feelings are supposedly about. In fact, on some level, the speaker probably feels that the woman only has value and importance insofar as she relates to men like himself. So he makes this all about him. And instead of exploring how he and this woman could relate or do relate, he only really examines his relations with his own feelings as personified in the figure of love. Look at this. What sugared terms, what all-persuading art, what sweet mellifluous words, what wounding looks love used for his admittance to my heart. He's talking about a seduction, but he's kind of talking about how he's been seduced by love. Perhaps how he's been seduced by his own feelings. Again, the woman herself slips out of the narrative. We don't know what the story is precisely, but we can reasonably speculate that these sugary tactics are the same kind of tactics that the speaker would use to try and possess this woman. Perhaps he has tried them and she has managed to keep him away. Even if he hasn't attempted sweet words in reality, he's probably fantasized about it. So the speaker sidelines and almost erases this woman he supposedly loves and presents himself the victim of this kind of stalkerish, persistent seduction. He takes exactly the sort of behaviour he's been guilty of, or would like to be guilty of, and complains that he's suffered from that behaviour. I won't go much further with this interpretation. I do like this approach because I think it captures a lot of what's strange and problematic about the poem. But we mustn't forget to look for counter-evidence. One possible piece of counter-evidence is this word lovers. Love looketh fair, but lovers are accursed. Now, doesn't lovers maybe suggest that there has been some kind of relationship, romantic or sexual, between the speaker and the speaker's beloved? If we think it absolutely does imply that, then we need to reject or seriously modify this interpretation that I've proposed. But on the other hand, I think we have some leeway here. Lovers might not mean people who are in a relationship with one another. It might mean people who are in love with somebody. And in that case, the word lovers in the line, lovers are accursed, might not refer to the speaker and his beloved. It might refer to the speaker and other men like him, men who are in love or think they are. So that's a close reading of the poem, focusing mostly on content. Of course, in your passage analyses, you're asked to focus on the text as a poem. So in the second part, I'm going to briefly run through some basic formal features of this sonnet.